So let's talk a little bit about the the religion, the sport of CrossFit, and how it applies as a conditioning modality to other sports. Now, there's no doubt about it. CrossFitters, high-level CrossFitters, are incredibly fit. They're really, really fit and usually very tough individuals. I've got to give them that credit. Now, on a recent Joe Rogan podcast, Faraz Zahabi, GSP's coach, brought up an objection, one of his objections, and that is that CrossFit is designed around becoming exhausted, really grinding yourself down into the dirt, right? You're either doing as many reps as possible of an exercise or of a complex within a certain amount of time. You've got 20 minutes. How many cycles of kipping pull-ups and bench press can you do? I'm just making that up. Sorry, CrossFitters, if that's not actual programming, but I'm going to pick a whole bunch of examples here that might not actually be true if you get really down into it, but are generally true. So you're either doing as many reps as possible in a given amount of time, or you're going to try and complete a certain number of reps or a certain number of circuits as fast as you can, faster than the guy next to you. But either way that you structure that, you're going to be exhausted. You're really going to leave it all on the gym floor. You shouldn't have been able to do another rep. You shouldn't have been able to go any faster. And for Faraz, the problem is that MMA fighters, it's such a diverse sport, they've also got to be doing their boxing. They've also got to be doing their kickboxing. They've also got to be doing their wrestling. They've also got to be doing their jiu-jitsu. They've also got to be doing their recovery. If they're just completely destroyed from CrossFit, they won't have the energy to do those other things. So I hope I'm interpreting that correctly. That is my interpretation of his critique of CrossFit. And I think that's a valid critique. However, it applies more to high-level athletes, guys who are training 2 or 3 times a day anyway. The high-level UFC fighters that Faraz is dealing with. It's totally a valid problem or concern when it comes to those guys. But what about more recreational people? I think it's still a concern there. Say you got a recreational guy. Doesn't matter if he's doing mogul skiing or distance swimming or jiu-jitsu or karate or kickboxing. Maybe he gets to train in his real sport, say 3 days a week, and then does a few CrossFit sessions a week to augment that. That's where I think the problem comes in. And the central problem, the thing that I've really got a problem with, is CrossFit's tendency to use complex, skill-dependent, and dangerous movements in an exercise sequence when you're going to be exhausted. These complex and technically difficult and dangerous motions that I'm talking about are mostly the Olympic lifting exercises. The clean and jerk, the snatch, but there are other ones as well. Kipping pull-ups can injure a lot of people. They've injured me. I know other people that they've injured. It's a complex movement. It's difficult to do correctly. It can be dangerous, and it's an explosive motion. I think that's another component of what makes certain lifts dangerous. A clean and jerk is an explosive motion. A snatch is an explosive motion. A kipping pull-up is an explosive motion. Now, some movements, like a deadlift, that form a really big part of the CrossFit methodology, are fine. I'm a huge advocate of deadlifts. I'm just not an advocate of running 400 meters all out and then deadlifting 10 reps of whatever weight and then running 400 meters all out, and then doing 10 deadlifts of a certain weight. I think that a deadlift is a fantastic motion, but combining it, mixing it up with rowing, with burpees, with sprinting, with other weight training exercises, you can start getting into really dangerous country. But the biggest culprit really has to be the Olympic lifts. Even the clean and jerk, right? It's a simpler motion than snatch. Even the clean and jerk results in a lot of injured wrists. And that's because when people do it and they don't know what they're doing, and this is what I did when I didn't know what I was doing, they haul the bar up to their shoulders, they use their body maybe even, and then they drop it down on their wrists, and their wrists take the damage. What you're actually supposed to do is drop it on your deltoids. If you're flexible enough, you can bring your fingers all the way back to your deltoids, and there's a very specific form to doing the clean and jerk. The snatch, obviously, that's pretty dangerous too. You're taking a bar from the floor and up above your head. If you lose it up there, if it falls back, either it's going to land on your head, it's going to land on your neck, it's going to rip your shoulder off. It's a dangerous motion, especially if you do it wrong. So people are going to say, yes, but we have proper training. That's great. if you're doing those complex movements, you should definitely have proper training. You should definitely learn exactly where to put your fingers, exactly how to position your wrist, exactly make sure that your knees are pointing the correct direction, make sure your back isn't too arched one way or slumped forward. All these things are really important, and some CrossFit schools have really high-level training in the Olympic list, and some don't. Let's be honest here. A lot of these guys go off for a couple-day training course to get certified in Olympic lifting, and then they come back. It's not like you're training often with somebody who spent a lifetime on his Olympic lifts and knows them inside out. But let's assume that you've watched the videos, you've filmed yourself, you've gone and gotten coached, you have a good clean and jerk. Let's just give that as a given. You've got a good clean and jerk, but do you have it when you're exhausted, after you've finished running your 800-meter sprint, after you've just done as many yards as you can in 3 minutes on the concept rower? Your form, when you're tired, goes to hell. This is a very, very common thing, and it's how a lot of people get injured. They might show you a perfect clean and jerk when they're fresh, when they're warmed up nicely, stretched out, and they're in the zone. They might show you great form. You don't have to watch that many CrossFit competitions to start seeing some incredible endurance, some really good strength, some amazing grit and determination and toughness, but terrible form. Right? You see deadlifts going to hell, and it's like, oh my God, that person's going to be suffering in the morning. Or you have people who are injured by the above the head motions or behind the neck motions, or injure their wrists. Usually, when I meet somebody who does CrossFit, I ask, how are your wrists? Have you injured your wrists yet? And about half the time, it's a very, very rough estimate, about half the time, they admit to having injured their wrists, and almost always it's the clean and jerk. So, you can screw up the motion itself, or you can have the motion but screw it up under duress. There's this idea of training for high-risk activities with relatively low-risk training. We do this in jiu-jitsu all the time. You don't go balls to the wall, all out, and crank your heel hooks on your buddies and do your flying arm bars against seated guard full speed every time against everybody, because if you did, everybody at the club would be injured and unable to compete. No, there's a lot of easy rolling. You might push it sometimes, but most of your sparring, most of your rolling isn't going to be at 100%. You know where you save that? You save that for the tournament. So you're training for a high-risk activity, a jiu-jitsu tournament, a judo tournament, a wrestling tournament, a kickboxing fight, an MMA fight. These are all high-risk activities, but your training shouldn't be as risky or as dangerous as the activity itself. There's a statistic out there, and I think it was for wrestling, that the chances of getting injured per minute of competing in wrestling are something, I want to say, 40 times higher than the chance of injury per minute of competition. So your odds of getting injured in a competition are 40 times higher than in the wrestling room. I'm 100% sure that a very similar statistic applies to MMA, to jiu-jitsu, to judo, to combat sports. You're just going to push it that much harder. The other guy's going to be going 100%. It's a risky activity, so you don't want to injure yourself in your training. That's the lower risk activity that you need to do a ton of. Let's take a ridiculous example. Do you know what the Tough Mudder is? The Tough Mudder is this adventure race where you're running, and then you climb over a wall, and then you're running, and you crawl underneath barbed wire, and then you're running, and you have to go through an electrified fence, and then you're running, and they spray you with water, and it's kind of sort of like an army obstacle course, the Tough Mudder. Let's say that your goal is to get in shape. You're like, man, I ate way too much ice cream this summer, and fall is coming, there's that winter vacation I want to look good on, or I'm getting married next spring. I got to get back in shape. But my plan is, I'm just going to do a Tough Mudder every day from now till 3 months from now. That's not the way that you get in cardio shape. You will destroy yourself. A Tough Mudder is great. I totally advocate doing things like that. You're going to do them once in a while. You know what? To train for a Tough Mudder even, you're not going to be doing the Tough Mudder every single day. You're going to be running. Today is my running day. The Tough Mudder is 10 kilometers long. I'm going to go run 10 kilometers. That's a good plan. The Tough Mudder involves climbing walls. Today I'll work on my wall climbing technique. It's the same way that if a pro boxer's got a title fight 3 months out, He doesn't go and do 12 rounds every day really hard with the toughest opponent that he can. He doesn't simulate that title fight every day, day after day after day after day, because he'd be destroyed. You need to train for the high-risk activity, the Tough Mudder, the boxing match, the jiu-jitsu match with lower risk activities. So for every training modality, you have to evaluate the risk and the reward. No doubt CrossFit is a high reward activity. People who do CrossFit are tough, they're determined, they're gritty, they're strong, they've got great endurance. It's fantastic, but it's a high risk activity. Unless your goal is to become good at CrossFit, I think it's a dangerous thing to take the entire CrossFit training modality and just adopt it for your already risky sport. Let's say you're a mogul skier, right? And let's get away from jiu-jitsu. Let's say you're a mogul skier and you got to go out there. There's a good chance you're going to hurt yourself mogul skiing. You're moving very fast down a bumpy hill with your legs going like pistons. You're probably not going to get through a career in mogul skiing uninjured. At some point, you will be seeing an orthopedic surgeon. Pretty much for sure. But if you're already injured from doing your clean and jerk, or you're having your snatch go bad when you're tired, when you're exhausted, when you set up a risky training situation, you're way increasing the chance you're going to get injured before you even get to your sport and within your sport. There's a risk and a reward. So, what are some ways that you can train for a risky sport with less risk but still reasonably high reward activities? And alternately, how can you modify some CrossFit exercises so that you're not being as much at risk? So I'm going to answer that in reverse order. I think the reliance on Olympic lifting when you're tired, when you're under duress is crazy. I think Olympic lifts have got great value. They've got that explosiveness that you develop in the hip, that forward bridging, essentially a bridging motion of the hip. It develops a very strong posterior chain. It makes you explosive, and you can get some or even most of those benefits with kettlebell swings. Kettlebell swings have much that same motion where you have to thrust your hips forward, where you have to extend up, where you have to use where you have to use explosiveness. But it's a much simpler motion, especially if you're just doing the basic swing and you're not trying to rack the kettlebell. You'll get 70% of the benefit that you will doing the full clean. I've also heard football coaches talk about that they just do high pulls, right? Where they take the bar and they basically do everything in a clean, pulling it as high as they can, but they don't rack it on their wrists. They just pull up, or they explode, and they pull up and they let it back down. They get that explosive part, they get the high reward part of the motion without using the high risk part of the motion, which in the case of the clean is coming underneath and catching it on the wrists, and hopefully you're doing that all correct. And you're less likely to do that correctly if you're tired. It's tough to do that correctly under the best of circumstances, and having just finished up a 400 meter all-out sprint is definitely not the best of circumstances. So if you're going to follow sort of a CrossFit workout of the day conditioning regimen, good for you. May I make some suggestions so that when you injure yourself, you can come back, listen to this video, and maybe then use those suggestions. Be careful of mixing in Olympic lifting with endurance-based training. If you are going to do the Olympic lifting component, do it at the beginning of your workout. Do it when you're reasonably fresh. It's a very skill-dependent, very technical motion, and you don't want to be exhausted when you're doing it. If you have to include the complex Olympic lifts inside an exercise routine, consider going to high pulls instead of clean and jerks. Consider going to high pulls, maybe even with more weight, instead of snatches. Consider going to kettlebell swings because you're less likely to screw yourself up when you're tired with those lifts. I also think a lot of people injure themselves with deadlifts when they're exhausted. I think something like a hex bar deadlift, which moves the weight that you're lifting a little bit back. It moves it from being in front of your shins to kind of in line with your ankles. And besides, it's supposed to have higher carryover to running and other athletic motions anyway. So I think the hex bar deadlift, a little bit safer than the regular deadlift. This idea of risk versus reward, let me just finish with a couple more thoughts on that. I'm a firefighter, and when we go to a house fire or when we go to an emergency, we're always balancing risk versus reward. For a little reward, we'll risk a little. For a big reward, we will risk more. Say we go to a house. There's a house, there's black smoke coming out of all the windows, there's flames shooting out through the roof, and we pull up and the neighbors go, there's nobody in there. That family went on vacation yesterday, nobody home, no cats, no dogs, no babies. We're probably gonna sit back, surround and drown, keep the other houses safe, spray water in through the windows. We're not going in there. That smoke is a poisonous, carcinogenic, explosive, flammable atmosphere. There's nothing good in there for you. If that wasn't on fire, and I told you, if you go in there, that entire building is full of carcinogenic propane. There is no such thing as carcinogenic propane, but let's invent carcinogenic propane and run in there, you wouldn't go. But it's a fire. So a lot of firefighters want to go. No. The risk is too high for the amount of reward you're going to get. Now, on a different day of the week, we pull up at a childcare, at a daycare. And again, the thing's on fire. Are we going to take more risks? Absolutely. Are there kids in there? If yes, the potential reward, the idea of saving a life, is much higher. And so the reward is higher. The risk is still the same. We might take that risk to get that reward. We're not going to risk it all for no reward, but for a big reward, we might risk it. One other thing that came to mind as I was preparing for this rant was big wave surfing, and in particular a guy called Mark Fu. Mark Fu was a pioneer of big wave surfing. He drowned in the mid-90s at Mavericks in California. They think he was held under by his leash, wrapped it around a rock or some coral or something, and he was held under there and drowned tragically. But I read an article about him once, and I think it was an Outside magazine. I'm not sure. If you find it, let me know. And the article went on about how this guy doing this incredibly dangerous activity, big wave surfing, you could die. Water weighs a lot. Those waves don't look very big, except if you're right at the bottom and the wave is 4 stories up over your head. Then it looks gigantic. They said that he drove like a little old lady, a cautious little old lady going around town, right? So isn't it interesting that this guy who had balls of steel, who knew what the risks were, presumably had other people he knew injured or killed, was willing to take those risks, paid the ultimate price for taking those risks, but still was a huge risk mitigator in the rest of his life. He didn't want to die driving around town. He didn't want to die racing to beat the red light. He didn't want to die cutting some dude off. He wanted to be safe in the rest of his life. Now, unfortunately, his passion, surfing, caught up to him. Like alpinists, like cave divers, it is a numbers game, and eventually your number's going to be up. If you do the sport long enough, you will not survive. The goal is to get old and quit before you die. It's an inherently incredibly dangerous sport, and he paid the price. But he knew about risk mitigation, right? He was very, very safe in one aspect of his life so that he could risk it all in a different part of his life. If we're doing a dangerous sport, earlier I used mogul skiing as an example. It doesn't matter if it's mogul skiing. It could be kiteboarding. It could be windsurfing. It could be jiu-jitsu. It could be kickboxing. It could be MMA. You want the other things that help that to be reasonably safe, especially conditioning, because there are pretty good alternatives. You can do it fairly safely. You can cut out the most dangerous exercises and still get most of the benefit. You can lower the risk while keeping the reward pretty much the same. So there. That is my single biggest problem with CrossFit as the universal answer to all conditioning problems in the combat sports. Take care, and I'll see you another day.